Hello, everyone. I hope the coffee already kicked in for everyone. Everyone is motivated and ready to jump into the first legal topic. Well, it will not be that legal. It's a legal presentation that's targeted at people working on the technical aspects. It's about operational resilience of in the financial sector and specifically of all the ICT infrastructure. So really, if you're a dev, what do you need to think about? What will the regulator point out as being a potential shortcoming? And I've picked this picture of like a cat. You'll see there's a lot of cats in my presentations, trying to make love fun, as announced, sitting on broken computers. This whole presentation is about what do we do when the systems just go down? What do we do to avoid that users complain? The regulator points out some shortcomings by saying we were not prepared for the situation. Like, what happens there? So what is DORA to start with? Well, DORA is something that was already published a while ago. When we think about the first draft of this digital operational resilience framework was published in 2020. Since 2022, we have the actual final text. It entered into force already 2 years, nearly 2 years ago, and it's effective since January this year. How come that we haven't heard more about DORA so far? It's not as if it popped out of the blue. Everyone was mentioning MiCA. MiCA and am I a CASP? Is DeFi excluded? What do we do? Do I need to publish a white paper? This was the major topic. But the thing is, DORA was out there too. And people don't seem to realize that there are consequences to this regulation as well if you're in the crypto sector. Now, what is digital operational resilience? Like a complicated word, like something that seems very theoretical, but as I mentioned, it's simply ensuring that you will be able to provide a service even if part of your ICT infrastructure goes down. How do you ensure you have integrity, that the data will not be hacked, will not be manipulated? How do you ensure that the system doesn't completely break down and you cannot provide your financial service anymore? So it's basically about minimizing the risk beforehand, just to make sure that you just end up with an issue being like, damn, I did not take this into account. What do we do now? Which is a good thing, right? So is it just another brick in the wall? Well, there was already something out there in the EU. So I focus on the European context here. Doesn't mean that there's nothing in Switzerland, but the EU is kind of the interesting jurisdiction lately. So we had a cybersecurity directive. The thing is, it was applicable regardless of the sector, but only to essential and important entities and specific types of infrastructures as well. So most of the providers were like, we're not concerned, we don't need to take this into account, it's all fine. Now with DORA, everyone needs to take it into account. If you provide something in the financial sector, you provide an ICT service, or like you rely on ICT assets, DORA is something you need to keep at the back of your mind. And it's regardless of the size. I'll dive into this a bit more. So it's another brick in the wall, although there was already something beforehand, but it's one that we really need to look at. Now, is it a recipe for success? What do we have in DORA concretely? Well, we have risk management, testing, information sharing, incident reporting, both for ICT assets, meaning anything internal, or the infrastructures that you control and decide to implement, that you will be updating, maintaining, and so on, but also for ICT third-party service providers, so anyone to whom you outsource specific activities, like any ICT provider there, so anything external. Now, Web3 and DORA, what happens there? Well, when you look at the scope of DORA, you see clearly crypto asset service providers, so all the CASPs, everyone that is currently in the process of obtaining a license in the EU. And you see this ICT third-party service provider thing, like what does that mean concretely? And in the cybersecurity directive, as I mentioned, the one that most people were not really caring about, well, you had thresholds. But when you think about it, those thresholds are often met by any major project that already had some VC funding. And cloud computing, you have increasingly decentralized cloud computing projects, anything that's like trust service providers and so on. You have increasingly decentralized projects, or like even centralized projects in the Web3 sector that try to mimic this kind of services that were typically more like Web2 based. So actually, maybe you need to take this into account by now. Now, DORA, what do we target specifically from that list? So any centralized Web3 provider, be it like a TradFi entity integrating Web3 or just CeFi, an exchange integrating Web3 aspects, well, you need to take this into account. Anyone who falls under the scope of MiCA. Then you also have fake DeFi, because this is the major question. What is DeFi currently? When can I be sure that I don't need to care about MiCA? Well, We are still discussing this. There's some guidance. Danish authorities provided some guidance. We have a report that was published by the European Banking Authority and ESMA recently that clarifies the landscape, but it's not supposed to be taken into account as a source of truth for what means decentralization under MiCA. It's like an express disclaimer at the beginning of the report. So we still have a lot of questions there, but a lot of projects, even if we take a very broad understanding of decentralization, clearly don't fall onto it. I label myself as DeFi, and people are supposed to assume I'm DeFi, but all these projects, once we have more clarity, will potentially need to care about DORA as well. And then Web3 infrastructures. But then what if these infrastructures are decentralized? We will dive into it a bit further, like what do we do with DORA if there's no one responsible? I just have this decentralized oracle, there's no one I'm talking to, there's like an anonymous team, what do I do there? Well, on top of that, there's the idea of a critical third-party service provider. So you provide a service, but on top of that, well, if I fail, nothing works anymore. And you may have a systemic risk. I mean, we had plenty of occasions in the Web3 system where the failure of one actor triggered the failure of others, and that you can hardly substitute as well. So when you have, let's imagine, a new type of technology that doesn't have a direct substitute, and you integrate that in your systems by saying, this is so great, I'll be the first one to use it, what is your backup plan? Like, who do you rely on? So basically, you're integrating a critical third party, and on top of that has no substitute, and that you need to take into account in your risk assessments, as I will mention afterwards. So a lot of infrastructures could be critical, meaning the obligations under DORA will be even bigger. Now, what's the fuss all about? Like, why do we care? So this is the scope. We know why operational resilience matter in general. Now, what happens with DORA? Well, first, in terms of risk management, they just ask you to think twice before integrating anything, be it an asset or a third-party provider, and to document everything. And then documenting can be a pain, plus you need to audit it internally and potentially externally. So what they said is this proportionality. Depending on the size, the risk exposure, who is interacting with you, we will not force you to provide a 100-page report on everything. You need to adjust it to the actual operations. But still, you need to do something at least. You cannot say, we'll figure it out over time. You're supposed to have documentation for everything. And there's a lot of aspects. We'll see it afterwards. Then also the management body bears the responsibility for the management. So if ever something happens and people can just say, hey, you have not planned it in advance while you were supposed to do, there is some obvious responsibility there. You need to map all the ICT assets and all the third-party service providers. Nowadays, when you check a lot of products, you kind of are not aware of all the dependencies. You need to figure out what they rely on. You often have it listed in the documentation, but sometimes it's not complete, sometimes it's not updated, and then you still need to figure out some additional aspects. So here you're supposed to have somewhere a clear map of everything that happens so that you can figure out who failed and who you need to reach out to. Now, a lot of questions. It seems easy. You just need to manage the risk and foresee things. But to evaluate the risk, what will be the due diligence standard there? If you integrate AI agents, if you integrate some innovative ZK proofs, okay, you're supposed to assess the risk, but you're discovering new risks as you go, as the landscape evolves. We've seen this with DeFi. There was some risks, even economic risks, that people were not taking into account at first, and realize them afterwards. So what is the due diligence standard? If I did an assessment at one point in time, I need to update it, but what if something seems obvious in hindsight but was not back in the time? How will the authorities assess that? Methods for incident detection. This is a great thing, actually, because instead of just relying on some security providers notifying an incident on Telegram, you're supposed to proactively monitor everything and just realize it yourself, not wait for someone to post on Twitter, hey guys, you're hacked today. You're supposed to realize it yourself and not wait for someone to tell you that. So this is a good thing, but how do you then remedy the issues you've pointed out? So imagine you integrate a decentralized infrastructure. You're supposed to react ASAP, but you don't control the infrastructure in the first place, so what do you do? Incident communication. This is great because often communication in the Web3 sector is quite hectic when an incident occurs. You just have some people communicating a lot. Do I need to, what information is basically the user entitled to? Having this in advance also helps internally to avoid that, the lawyer is just appalled by what you published afterwards because you had a strategy in advance. Now, also, you're supposed to integrate only tools that are reliable and adequate for your activity. But if you integrate a decentralized infrastructure, can it be deemed reliable in the first place? Can I rely on something that could be modified by a DAO vote? Can I rely on something that I actually don't control? You need to have continuity policies as well, but under that, posing the whole system. Is that enough? Like, how do we ensure that if ever one aspect of the system fails, I still can continue providing the service? Like in many cases, what we see is just that everything is paused. Is that okay? For how long can it be paused? So very practical questions there. You're supposed also to conduct an impact analysis and know in advance if something fails, what's the extent of like the potential harm, who is affected, how far does it go. So you cannot just leave it aside and say, we'll see once this happens. It's just a risk. You're supposed to figure it out in advance, which is great, because unfortunately in practice what we see is that because we need to go so fast in the Web3 space, these things are left aside. It's like, we're going to figure out the major risks and the rest, let's see as we go. Here, it's like I would say it's actually part of a recipe for success, so DORA is good in that respect. You're supposed to think twice before you do something, which is great because we always say innovate, break things, and just apologize afterwards. Maybe not when it comes to finance and technical aspects, because if you build something and want people to onboard billions with you, maybe you want to give them at least small guarantees that the whole infrastructure will not break down. And then backup policies and recovery procedures. I mean, it's quite obvious when some systems are storing even encrypted copies of private keys and so on. Well, you'd be surprised. Some of these projects don't figure out backup policies from the beginning. It's like, oh, we have a first implementation, then we'll figure out the backup second. Okay, but what if something happens in the first weeks? What do you do there? But also, is it relevant in a Web3 context? Blockchains are decentralized ledgers. So if some information is already on blockchain, it means that this actually doesn't make sense in a Web3 setting. So when do you need to back up something? When do you need to have recovery procedures and this kind of things? And especially, like, what do you do when there's no possible recovery procedure in the first place? Now, when the risk materializes, it's also very interesting because currently you'll have a notification, something happens, but it's basically it. Now, here, breaking news, you can voluntarily report any threats, which is great. We'll have, like, let's say, a better understanding of what's happening in the Web3 space, because for now, if something happens, you maybe don't necessarily want to disclose it to the public, but if at least authorities are aware of like all the threats out there, it can enhance like the whole knowledge of the ecosystem and how we prevent them in the long term. And then it's compulsory to report major incidents to the authorities. I mean, I'll dive into it on the next slide a bit more. You could outsource this by saying, okay, I don't handle that part, I have a security firm, they do all this thing, but you're still responsible for the whole notification system. And then that's pretty cool, you have templates, so you know what information to fill in exactly. And this also exists on the Cybersecurity Directive. But the fun part, DORA kind of goes far in terms of, I know that the speed of reaction when something happens is very fast anyways. If you get hacked, you react in the next hours, you create a war room, you do something, you just figure out where did the funds go, how do we react, do we pose everything. But still, it means that you need to handle all of these aspects from like a traceability technical perspective, and on top of that, you're supposed to have someone maybe with some legal background to figure it out, who is able to notify this and fill in like the basic information within 24 hours. Then they'll transfer this information to the relevant, like the authorities will transfer it to the relevant other authorities, which may even give you some advice, which is great. But then you're also already supposed to have a report within 72 hours. Clearly the team will not sleep at that point. Like, these deadlines are super short. So I'm quite curious how this will be implemented in practice by most actors, because 24 hours just to notify, fine, but prepare a report while handling all the rest. Just think about the Web3 ecosystem. Major players, VC funding, teams of like 20 people, great. You have a 5-people team, they really need a lot of Red Bull and coffee to prepare that. And then a final report within 1 month. Same, it really depends. Will you have after 1 month all the necessary information? Depending on the type of technology that was involved, it may be a bit complicated to figure out as well. And so what? What is the issue here? If you're a centralized actor, all of this makes sense. It's basically like a good, let's say, a golden standard rule book. It should be more or less easy to implement depending on your size. The only thing that will be a blocker here is like, what if I want to integrate decentralized infrastructures or like DeFi in the broad sense? The first question is like, is DeFi a service or is it an asset? Is it something I'm integrating under my responsibility? With all these mentioned shortcomings, I don't control it. So how do I react to those kind of things? Can I actually integrate DeFi? Or is it a service? But if it's a service, who am I contracting with? One of the main, let's say, ways of controlling third-party ICT service providers is by having, like, DORA is requiring an adequate agreement in place. I mean, most of us know how things work in the DeFi space. It's going to be Telegram messages and then like, yeah, guys, we're partnering up. This is not an adequate agreement. And if you need an agreement, who do you execute it with? Is a proposal approved by the DAO supposed to be an agreement? Like, how does that work? I'm not sure the authorities will accept that. So you already have a blocker there. Is if I am a centralized entity trying to integrate DeFi, either I do it under my responsibility and expose myself to higher risk of maybe the authorities pointing out that this was not a very reasonable approach, or I try to onboard them as a service, but then I have a major blocker. Does that mean that all this hype of integrating TradFi and CeFi with DeFi will be kind of put to an end? Or how can we circumvent that? It will be very interesting to see in practice how the different national authorities in member states react to this kind of integrations that in the US apparently can work out. So let's see how Europe works with that. So this is a major thing. And the other aspect is I'm a DeFi project. So, okay, maybe I'm somewhere on the edge. I'm tending towards decentralization, but have some centralization points. Authorities realize that, say like, yeah, we're supposed to be a CASP. So first of all, you don't have a license, you should have one. Okay, I'll go for a license then. DORA, how do I implement DORA? I gave part of the control away to a community. How do I work this out? And this kind of things. So basically, it goes down to this. Currently, DeFi, I reuse this slide quite often. This is like how I perceive DeFi currently. You can do whatever you want. No one is controlling that. It's all under your own risk. It's this beautiful beach where you can swim as you want, but if a shark comes over, no one will save you. Now, with DORA, even if you believe you're not subject to DORA, what you could do is take it as guidance. Have I foreseen in the code something that will allow people to feel a bit more secure? Do I know exactly the risk of what I'm launching as a product? It's great, it's a public good, but you don't want to create public goods that can backfire. Meaning, even DeFi projects should have a look at DORA and just consider, if I was centralized, would I be able to meet these requirements? Because I'm decentralized, how can I meet them in a decentralized fashion, just to reassure people? And this is basically the end, but I hope this inspired you to think about what you're building, if you're a builder, and if you have a project, just to think, yeah, maybe I'm offering something that has something at stake, and I don't want users to complain afterwards, just because I wanted to innovate at all costs without thinking about the consequences. Thank you very much.
The mitigation action, as you mentioned, they are totally different challenges compared to an ICT classical approach. But my question, from a framework perspective, all those topics that you mentioned, they are part of the challenge or the topic is management, documentation, proper SLA agreements. They are already part of ISO 27001. So from a regulation standpoint, what's the difference, or where is the different focus from DORA compared to the ISO 27001?
It's just to make people aware that you need to follow this kind of standards because it's industry practice. Like when you say something is industry practice and it's a good standard, it's just business partners who expect this from you. But there are like no actual sanctions other than you will not be able to interact with specific partners. Here, you have a regulation with some consequences, and if you don't comply, you know that there will be sanctions.
Scary people.
It's exactly to scare people. it's the same. I would compare it to anything that's related to CSR, like corporate social responsibility. It was always in the landscape of saying like, oh, you're supposed to do good and take things into account, but once you integrate it into a regulation, be like, damn, now I really need to do that. So it's exactly the same.
Thank you.